Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Assassin's Creed Origins, along with its DLCs, The Hidden Ones, and The Curse of the Pharaohs, all of which are available for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4, and what you're going to be seeing throughout this video is the PC version. This is an action-adventure game developed by Ubisoft Montreal and released in 2017 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4, and while there was a Stadia version that released back in 2020, Stadia is no longer available, so the only versions you're going to be able to play are the PS4, Xbox, and PC versions anyway, so it's probably better to forget the Stadia version even existed at all. Anyway, Origins is the 10th main installment in the Assassin's Creed franchise, and it came 2 years after the previous main installment, which was Assassin's Creed Syndicate. By the time Syndicate came out, the franchise fatigue was in full swing, and after that game's weak sales, Ubisoft decided to slow things down a bit with the franchise and give the developers more time to get Origins finished up. Thus, there was a roughly 2-year gap between Syndicate and Origins, and between that gap in release years, the gameplay changes that Origins introduced, as well as its very fresh setting of ancient Egypt, the furthest back in history that the franchise had gone up to that point, Origins was generally seen as a significant breath of fresh air for the Assassin's Creed franchise, and it was quite well received when it originally released. Now, of course, in hindsight, Origins suffers from a lot of the homogenization problems that have plagued Ubisoft's releases over the past decade or so. So ironically enough, these days, it's really more the opposite situation, where Ubisoft game fatigue is at an all-time high, and Origins actually suffers from that, as opposed to being the breath of fresh air that it might have been for the franchise back in 2017. Now, how much it suffers from that effect, you'll understand more as I progress through the video, but before we get to that, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here. So let's just go ahead and start delving right into this thing and see what it is, how it compares to the previous Assassin's Creed games and what made it such a breath of fresh air back then, and whether or not it's actually any good. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, and before I get too far into this, I want to mention that the game did launch with some pretty significant performance issues, and some of those haven't quite been ironed out. Now, on my rig, which is a Ryzen 9 5900X, 64 gigs of RAM, and an RTX 3080 12GB model, and the game generally runs pretty well on that. I'm usually getting around 90 to 144 frames. I do have the frame rate capped at 144 because that's my monitor's refresh rate. But at least on this particular rig, the game runs quite well, even when you're in the very heavily populated city areas that generally tank the game's performance. That said, on my previous rig, which is an i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1080, which is obviously a lot closer to the kind of hardware that was available at the time the game released, the game ran significantly worse. We're talking in the roughly 40s of FPS in the cities, and when you got outside of the cities, it would sometimes go up to roughly 80 or so. And a lot of that was probably due to the game being very processor heavy and a 4790K only being a quad core. Don't get me wrong, a 4790K is a great chip, but it really shows its age when it comes to these open world games that are very processor heavy and really benefit from having more cores. And at the time the game released, most people were still running dual and quad core processors, so they were going to suffer performance issues regardless. Obviously not as much of a problem these days because most gamers on PC have moved well beyond quad core processors, so they shouldn't run into too many issues there, but obviously your individual mileage is definitely going to vary, so just keep that in mind. Now, of course, when it comes to performance issues, one of the bigger questions is going to be, do those performance issues make sense? And for Origins, at least at the time it released, I think they do. After all, not only is it a large open-world game, but generally speaking, the visual fidelity is quite high. There are a few environmental objects here and there that are much lower detail, and if you're really paying attention, you might notice them. But in terms of the modeling, texture quality, shaders, the post-processing effects, all that sort of thing, they've done a very good job with it, and it holds up well to this day, although obviously modern games are going to be much higher visual fidelity just because hardware and software has improved since then. And as is typical for Ubisoft's games, especially the Assassin's Creed franchise, the art team deserves pretty much all of the praise that I can possibly heap on them because they have done a phenomenal job at rendering ancient Egypt. From the great monuments like, of course, the pyramids at Giza or the Great Sphinx, to the bustling cities and small villages, to the harsh deserts, Everything looks not only exactly like you would expect it to look, but it's all very vivid. They have done a great job with the aesthetics of this game and making sure that it's not super washed out in the color palette or anything like that. It was a massive breath of fresh air after Assassin's Creed Syndicate's very dour, grey, dull city of London, which, I mean, to be fair, you do expect that from Victorian London, but it was still quite boring to look at most of the time. Origins environments, on the other hand, still look fantastic. It's just a shame that the animations, more often than not, are going to take you out of the experience, especially the lip sync, which is just absolutely awful outside of major cutscenes. It is remarkably jarring going from the very well animated cutscenes,
what we believe in, our values, our creed, will unify us,
to the mannequin-style lip flaps that you get when you're just wandering around the overworld and talking to NPCs for side quests and such.
Walk.
They beat me. They beat me because they thought I'm Greek.
Wait, what happened to your stutter?
I was scared when I first met you. It makes me stutter.
Now, I understand that they had to be quite selective with where they put their efforts when it comes to animation, but when the difference is as stark as it is in Assassin's Creed Origins, it is incredibly jarring and will take you out of the experience pretty much every time you notice it, which is quite often. And the accompanying voice acting really doesn't help. A lot of the NPCs you talk to have what I would describe as very amateurish voice acting at best. It's not necessarily terrible, but it's a massive shift in quality compared to the main cast, and it is something you notice because the main cast is generally voiced very well. There's a lot of emotion in their performances, and they did a great job with it. The various NPCs you only encounter on side quests, on the other hand, well, let me put it this way. At times, they approach the stiffness of Two Worlds NPCs, albeit mercifully without ye olden time speech. And when combined with that rather awful lip syncing, the effect gets pretty rough. And it's especially odd given that the rest of the game's presentation is so strong. I mean, most of the visuals are great. Most of the animations are actually quite good as well, whether it be the parkour animations or, of course, the combat animations. Generally speaking, they've done a good job with all of that. And when you go to sound design, generally speaking, they've nailed that too. They've got good sound effects that all fit the game very well, and they have some nice meaty effects when you get into combat. And the soundtrack composed by Sarah Schachner is just downright excellent. It not only has those specific sounds we associate with ancient Egypt, but it also has some more modern stylings that actually work pretty well for it, considering it helps to tie it in more with the rest of the Assassin's Creed franchise. And not only does it all fit the game and its setting quite well, it just is damn good music in general. So when you bring all of that together, you have overall excellent presentation. It's just that the lip syncing and the voice acting outside of the game's main cast is so jarringly lower quality than everything else that you notice it all the time and it takes you out of the experience. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as Layla Hassan, a researcher for Abstergo, who is currently on assignment in Egypt in order to recover some artifacts for the corporation, and she finds out that the artifacts are related to and include the remains of one of the founding members of the Hidden Ones, which was the precursor to the actual Brotherhood of Assassins, a man named Bayek of Siwa, who was not necessarily stricken from records entirely related to the Brotherhood of Assassins and, of course, the Hidden Ones themselves, but was more or less forgotten in favor of other figures in the early days of the Brotherhood and the Hidden Ones taking center stage. Seeing this as a golden opportunity to further her own research and prove her worth to the Animus Project, Layla delves into the genetic memories of Bayek using a portable Animus that she has customized herself, and thus you get the story that anybody actually gives a single solitary crap about, which is everything taking place in the past. And the historical storyline in this is centered around the exploits of Bayek of Siwa and his various adventures around ancient Egypt, and as the game's title implies, the founding of the Hidden Ones, which would eventually become the Brotherhood of Assassins. Although when I say the words ancient Egypt, I really mean Ptolemaic Egypt during Cleopatra's rise to power and reign. And I feel the need to clarify that because a lot of people really don't understand just how long of a span of history the phrase ancient Egypt covers. The game takes place around the end of the Ptolemaic era, basically when Rome ended up conquering Egypt. And a lot of people will probably be surprised when you go to a lot of the main monuments that people are aware of, things like the Great Sphinx or the pyramids at Giza, and you find them in states that they're pretty recognizable as today. As in severely weathered, parts of them crumbling, chunks broken off, things like that. And players who don't necessarily know any better will look at that kind of thing and be like, what the hell is this? Why are these not in pristine condition? Well, that's because they were made about 25 plus hundred years before the events of the game, and they just suffered the effects of time and conquest and ravaging by bandits and so on and so forth. The things we think of in terms of ancient Egypt were already ancient at the time we consider Egypt to be ancient. Today we think of the likes of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, periods of history spanning roughly 500 to 600-ish years. But the phrase ancient Egypt refers to a span of history covering over 3,000 years. In other words, when you wander around the various monuments of ancient Egypt in this game, and you go into the tombs and the pyramids and such, and you find ancient writings from the Old Kingdom, as Bayek explicitly says himself, think about it this way. Those writings are to Bayek what writings from the earliest periods of ancient Greece are to us today. For a lot of people, that's really difficult to comprehend, but welcome to ancient Egypt. It is a long, complicated, and fascinating period of history, and I very highly suggest you look into it. Anyway, the events covering Bayek's journey specifically are in the latter half of the 1st century BC, so right around the time Cleopatra comes to power and just before the Roman conquest. The story starts out by establishing that Bayek is seeking revenge for the murder of his son Khemu by a group of masked figures that refer to themselves as various animals, as well as establishing him as one of the last, if not the last, of the Magi, which were a group of elite warriors who protected the pharaoh and the pharaoh's interests in ancient Egypt. But the thing is that we don't really have any historical records for their existence past about 1,000 years before the events of the game took place. So Bayek being the last of the Magi, and people even knowing what a Magi would be at that point in Egyptian history, is dubious at absolute best. But honestly, given all the other ridiculous crap that's in the Assassin's Creed franchise, especially with more recent entries, I wouldn't really say it's an issue worth complaining about here. Anyway, historical inaccuracies that would have been acceptable even in the earliest days of the Assassin's Creed franchise aside, Bayek is seeking revenge after an incident involving a group of masked men that ultimately led to the death of his son Khemu. And as the game starts out, he takes down one of those masked figures, and then there's only one left after that, which is basically the prologue to the game. Once you track down this one last masked figure and take him down, it's revealed that the men Bayek has been hunting down in search of revenge are only one small part of a much larger conspiracy that has been working behind the scenes for untold years to subjugate the people of Egypt to their own ends. And after a bit of persuasion from his wife Aya, ultimately, Bayek does decide to track down the other members of this conspiracy and take them down as well, only this time, instead of his only motivation being seeking revenge for his son Khemu, now there's that with the secondary objective of liberating the people of Egypt from the yoke of tyranny that has been plaguing them for untold years at this point. This ultimately puts Bayek in league with Cleopatra, who is ultimately trying to ascend to the throne of Egypt and depose her brother Ptolemy, who is the current king of Egypt at that point and is basically nothing more than a figurehead who is ultimately being controlled by the various figures that were part of this grand conspiracy. And you find out that this conspiracy is called the Order of the Ancients. And while their ultimate goals are a bit nebulous, the long and short of it is that they seek power to control the populace and establish what they think is order. And it's made abundantly clear throughout the game that they don't care what they have to do or who they have to do it to in order to achieve that. Thus, the majority of the story in Assassin's Creed Origins follows Bayek as he works with Cleopatra and her retinue as well as his wife Aya, who is off doing her own things as well, in order to figure out who these various conspirators in the Order of Ancients are, and ultimately take them down. Along the way, Bayek sees all the results of the dastardly deeds these various conspirators have been committing, and is working to rectify the situation and liberate the people of Egypt from the evil influence of the Order of the Ancients, and it actually works pretty well for the most part. There are certainly several moments throughout the storyline that are very predictable, and the antagonists are almost exclusively portrayed as just being completely one-dimensional, power-hungry psychopaths, with absolutely no nuance whatsoever, making it completely impossible to see where they might even remotely be coming from on why they're doing what they're doing. But for the most part, the protagonists are pretty decently written, especially Bayek himself, who is also very well acted, and is a very likable guy. He's got a very strong sense of honor and duty to both his people and his family. And while of course he is effectively fueled by rage the entire time, he ultimately channels that into a sort of righteous fury that he uses to protect the people of Egypt wherever he can. All the while showing, not simply telling, how much he cares about his friends, and especially his family, his wife Aya, his son Hemu, and all the while showing a sense of vulnerability in how much a lot of that weighs on him as he goes about doing what he's doing, and yet he still powers through it anyway. And while he certainly jokes around with people on occasion, it's always in situations where it's appropriate. It's not like with most modern writing, where they're just constantly throwing around quips and one-liners because Marvel movies were popular and they did that, so now it has to be done in pretty much everything these days. So weirdly enough, this game generally being quite grounded in, especially the characters, but just the writing in general, for the most part, we'll get there, don't worry, is incredibly refreshing in an era where the writing is getting increasingly ridiculous and cringe-inducing. Now, all that said, as refreshing as it is in an era that is increasingly obnoxious as far as writing goes, there are a few glaring issues with it, and there is one aspect that isn't really an issue, but it might be perceived as one. I'll go ahead and talk about that first. That is where Bayek, at times, is basically a side character in his own story. Now, it's nowhere near like it was in, say, the Book of Boba Fett, where the main character of the series is sidelined at pretty much every conceivable opportunity, and it's pretty obnoxious. Instead, it gives you a bit more context as to why Bayek was kind of lost to the history of the Brotherhood, whereas his wife Aya was not. You see, Bayek and Aya were basically the two co-founders of the Hidden Ones, the precursor to the Assassin Brotherhood that persists throughout the rest of the series. But whereas Bayek was primarily seeking revenge for his son and to put his son's soul at peace, as well as to help liberate the people of Egypt in the process, Aya was getting more directly involved with major historical events and characters. So, for example, she becomes strongly allied with Cleopatra and supports Cleopatra's rise to the throne, whereas Bayek doesn't really care about that as much as how the resources Cleopatra has access to will be able to help him find the people who murdered his son. So while he's definitely doing very important work for them and supporting his wife, supporting Cleopatra's rise to the throne, most of what he's doing is sort of indirectly involved. He's working mainly behind the scenes. Aya's involvement, on the other hand, is far more direct, and as the story progresses and you ultimately lead up to the founding of the Hidden Ones, it becomes a lot more clear why Aya was considered kind of a legendary founding member of the Hidden Ones, and thus the Brotherhood, while Bayek was more lost to the Brotherhood's history. The Hidden Ones would not have existed were it not for Bayek. He was vital to their founding, but because Aya was much more directly involved with major figures of the time, and she was much more of an idealistic, revolutionary kind of character, she ended up being kind of legendary in the Brotherhood's history, whereas Bayek just faded into the background. Thus, there are moments in the story where Bayek does feel like a side character in his own story, but unlike in, say, the Book of Boba Fett, where that's just annoying and obnoxious, in Assassin's Creed Origins it makes a lot more sense. The thing is that, while it makes sense from a writing perspective, it also features several moments throughout the story where you instead play as Aya and you're going through events that she was going through while Bayek was off doing his own thing. So, story-wise, it does make sense, but these moments do end up being fairly jarring because the gameplay is so different from everything else you've been doing up to that point, that it makes these moments simultaneously feel like they're actually fairly important for the story, but still feel like they're filler content. It's a pretty odd sensation, and it'll make more sense when I talk about it from a gameplay perspective, but don't worry, we'll get there when we get there. Now, this issue aside, there's also a few moments throughout the story where it pulls you out of the Animus, whether you want to be pulled out of the Animus or not, in order to have a sequence where you're messing around as Layla for a bit. And those sections might as well be filler content, because not only is the modern-day storyline in this thing pretty much completely superfluous to the entire experience of playing Assassin's Creed Origins, but it's actively quite annoying, because Layla herself is not an interesting character at all. Her sole personality traits in Assassin's Creed Origins are that she is utterly obsessed with her research, and she's annoyed whenever Abstergo interferes with her research. Now, there is a moment roughly halfway through the game where you get pulled out of the Animus and play as Layla again, and something happens to add on the personality trait of now she hates Abstergo for what they've done, but that's pretty much it, actually. There is almost nothing to the modern-day storyline in Assassin's Creed Origins, and it might as well not even be there. Which in turn makes the sections where you get pulled out of the Animus and get forced to play as Layla incredibly annoying. Now sure, that's on brand for the Assassin's Creed franchise. Whenever it pulls you out of the Animus and forces you to play modern-day sections, it's always annoying because they're always a complete afterthought to everything that was done in the Animus. But it's still frustrating to see Ubisoft just constantly repeat this mistake with every single game in the franchise and never seem to learn their damn lesson from it. People play the Assassin's Creed games because they want to mess around with the historical aspect of it. They don't care what goes on in the modern day because most of what happens in the modern day storyline is stupid at best and is otherwise superfluous and boring. Thus, in every single Assassin's Creed game, whenever it pulls you out of the Animus and has you do modern day stuff, it's pretty annoying. Thankfully, in Origins, it happens only a few times throughout the story, but it is still jarring, it is still annoying, and I do still have to point it out. The thing is that when it comes to the writing aspects, those are really the only major pacing problems. Most of the pacing problems are actually a result of gameplay more than anything else, so we'll talk about that more in a moment. But the other major problem with the writing is whenever they try to introduce broader elements of the Assassin's Creed franchise. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about Assassins versus Templars, or in this particular case, Hidden Ones versus Order of the Ancients. I mean, that's what the game is ultimately about. That's fine. What's not fine is the whole precursors, the apples of Eden, all that complete nonsense. The weird sci-fi but also fantasy elements that they continually insist upon shoehorning into the franchise, even though they really don't help and usually just make things a lot worse. So as to how that manifests in Assassin's Creed Origins, you're going about the task of eliminating all these various members of the Order of the Ancients, and then towards the end of the main storyline, they suddenly remember that this is an Assassin's Creed game, and thus it has to involve the precursors as well as the Apples of Eden, so they have to shoehorn those in somehow. Up to that point, the writing was actually fine. It was pretty grounded for the most part. Everything was very believable, albeit occasionally they would stretch things here and there for dramatic effect. And you could actually get into the story and the characters and the setting that was being presented. And then just suddenly, at the end of the game, when you're hunting down the last target, the game suddenly goes, oh, by the way, the Order of the Ancients have found a magic precursor staff that was in Alexander the Great's tomb, and they used it to open a vault that the Magi were protecting, which was ultimately why Khemu was killed at the beginning of the game. And your last target just takes the Apple of Eden, this sphere that has a bunch of markings on it, from the vault and uses it to mind control people. And then when you go to fight him, he uses it to spawn illusions to help him fight you, and You take him down and you get the apple and you put it in storage and say that it's a cursed object that should never see the light of day. And that's it. There is absolutely nothing else related to the precursors in the main storyline. It's all just in that last bit at the end. It comes out of kind of nowhere and is really jarring and really stupid, and it goes nowhere. I mean, at least with the earlier supernatural stuff that you would encounter in the earlier portions of the game, it was either Bayek seeing things while out in the desert, because there's an actual effect in the game where you start seeing mirages, and it's actually kind of cool. Or it would be things that might seem supernatural at first, but then you explore a bit and you find out that there's actually a perfectly rational explanation behind it. Or it would be a situation like you get a concoction from a priest and Bayek drinks it and he ends up passing out and having a very vivid vision of himself fighting the Soul Serpent. You have this big boss fight against the Soul Serpent, which is, again, pretty cool, but you know that that's only occurring in his head. It's not anything that's actually happening. And then all of a sudden you get weird supernatural BS at the end of the storyline just out of nowhere. They had the perfect opportunity to make an entire game where any of the precursor stuff is really just hinted at in the background, because most of the game you get that. You'll be exploring ancient tombs and you'll find precursor vaults, basically, that give you some knowledge of things to come and basically explain what was going on with the whole end of the world problem with Assassin's Creed 3 and that sort of thing. But those are just filling out lore. It's not, here's a magic orb that mind controls people. Oh, and by the way, even though this is a major plot device in most of the previous Assassin's Creed games, it's just one small plot point at the end of Assassin's Creed Origins, and it's not going to go anywhere. Considering how the Apples of Eden and the precursors are completely unimportant to the rest of the story, they very easily could have just told the entire story of Origins without having that in there. But instead, it's like the writers just suddenly remembered at the last minute that they had to include something about Apples of Eden and precursors because it's an Assassin's Creed game, and obviously Ubisoft especially, but somebody is going to expect there to be something about that in the game, so better go ahead and throw that in there. It's just abundantly clear at this point that all of the precursor stuff was a total mistake. This series should have just been about Assassins versus Templars throughout history. But no, the developers thought it would be far more interesting if they included all this precursor bullshit, and the series has just been suffering from it ever since. Anyway, point here is ultimately that most of the story and the character writing and, of course, the performances is all quite good. It's just that there are moments here and there where the pacing breaks down, especially when it comes to gameplay, which I'll get to here in a moment, as well as the forced inclusion of modern-day sections where almost nothing interesting happens, if anything at all happens, and the very abrupt, oh, by the way, here's some precursor stuff at the very end of the storyline of the base game, just ultimately drag down what is otherwise a quite solid storyline. Don't get me wrong, it's not amazing or anything, but it's definitely one of the better storylines in the Assassin's Creed franchise, precisely because it focuses a lot on what makes the entire premise of the shadow war between Assassins and Templars so interesting in the first place. And that, combined with Bayek's personal quest for revenge, is more than enough to see you through the rest of the game. The thing is, Assassin's Creed Origins isn't a linear game, it's an open world one, and the developers pace the game in such a way to where you cannot ignore the side content. You cannot simply play through the critical path, as it is referred to, only the story missions. Because in a move that has caused a lot of people to actually misclassify this game altogether, Ubisoft decided to level gate everything. Now, I am going to directly use this in a video I'm planning where I talk about what makes a role-playing game, and why so many games these days that are referred to as role-playing games are not in fact role-playing games. But the leveling system and gear system have caused a lot of people to act like Assassin's Creed Origins is some sort of RPG or action RPG. It is not. It is an action-adventure game where experience point-based leveling and a gear system were bolted onto it ramshackle. There is no role-playing to be done. You do not have any sort of in-character choice and consequence. Instead, the only RPG-ish element is that the entire gameplay loop is centered around number go up syndrome. Now sure, it's nowhere near as bad as the kinds of games I call out in my video on big numbers being stupid in games, but the simple fact of the matter is that they have tied every last bit of the game's challenge purely to the numbers. With the exception of boss-type enemies, so we're talking bosses that show up during the main storyline, as well as stuff like the bounty hunters that roam around the map, the challenges you face are due to what I would refer to as artificial difficulty. It's not that the enemies are smart, it's not that they are tricky to fight, it's not that the combat system is particularly difficult to get a hang of or anything like that. It's that enemies that are higher level than you take less damage from your attacks, and they also do considerably more damage to you when they do hit you. The way it basically works out is that you do normal damage to enemies that are the same level as you, and then with each subsequent level higher than you that an enemy is, you do less and less damage to them, and they do more and more damage to you. And the way this works out is that enemies of the same level or up to 2 levels higher than you are showing as just regular numbers when you mark them, and it shows their level over their heads. When you get to 3 and 4 levels higher than you, that number turns red, indicating that they are a high enough level compared to you that you're going to do barely any damage to them at all, and they're going to be capable of either outright one-shotting you or two-shotting you. And then once you get to 5 levels or more higher than you, then that red number will turn into a red skull, and it basically means that you have absolutely no hope of beating them until you level up. An enemy's level has absolutely no bearing on anything other than the amount of damage they do to you and the amount of damage you do to them. Enemies that are higher level don't have any extra abilities, they aren't smarter, they behave exactly the same as their lower level counterparts, they just do more damage to you and you just do less damage to them. This is where the pacing issues I mentioned really lie. It's not really a result of the writing as much as it is this leveling structure. As you're wandering around and exploring the world, you'll find that the various regions all have their own level ranges, and the missions themselves all have a level that it is recommended for you to be at bare minimum in order to complete that mission. The idea there is that as long as you're at least at the level that the mission recommends, you should be able to handle the enemies that it throws at you if it throws them at you at all. The thing is that while that's the idea, it's not always what happens in practice. Sometimes you'll go into a mission at the recommended level, and you'll run into enemies that are 3 or 4 levels higher than you, and you have to fight them. You have no choice. Even if you take the stealthy route, you simply don't do enough damage to be able to take out the enemies with a quick assassination. Instead, you'll do a stealth attack, which just does an amount of damage to them. It's a large amount of damage, sure, but as that level gap increases, the amount of damage gets less and less, of course. And once you've stealth attacked an enemy and they've survived it, then you have to follow that up with actual combat, and more likely than not, they're going to call their buddies over to help them out. So now you've got a mass battle on your hands, and it ends up getting really messy really quickly. Now sure, there are some tricks you can pull with this. You can attack enemies from a distance and go for headshots with the bows. You can, of course, do sneak attacks on enemies to get a large amount of damage in right at the beginning of the fight. If you do manage to take out an enemy and their buddies don't notice, then you can infect that body with flesh decay toxins so that when an enemy shows up and investigates the body laying there, they get infected with the poison and it does some damage to them over time. And of course, there's always the tried and true attack the enemy and then run away and use hit and run tactics in order to take them down. But none of that really solves the problem of just making the general gameplay of Assassin's Creed Origins quite tedious over time. Because as you're just going about missions normally, as long as they're at the same level as you or even up to 2 levels higher, Generally speaking, you don't even really need to worry about it that much. You can take enemies out with a single hit from the hidden blade. You can take them out with 1 or 2 headshots from your bow, or you can get into an actual melee fight with them, and it doesn't take absolutely forever. But once you start running into those enemies that are 3 or 4 levels higher than you, then that all goes out the window and everything just becomes obnoxiously tedious. And while technically you can complete these missions and defeat these enemies that are considerably higher level than you, it's so tedious that it becomes completely impractical. Thus, the game roadblocks you from completing the main story content and forces you to go into side content. And the quality of that side content varies wildly. On the dull, uninteresting side of things, you have the likes of clearing out animal dens or finding treasure that is placed somewhere in a small area and has a few guards around it. Or, of course, the so modern Ubisoft that it actually kind of hurts task of clearing out forts full of enemies and taking out the commanders of those forts and finding the loot hidden in them. And of course, all of that stuff is going to be very familiar to you if you played pretty much any Ubisoft game over the past decade or so. And then, of course, there are the side missions themselves, which can be more interesting because they typically have an actual storyline associated with them, although it's really an inconsequential one most of the time. And even those side missions, a lot of the time, just have you doing the kinds of activities that I just described, so they end up being those with extra steps. And obviously that wears thin pretty quickly. Of these side missions, I found the ones that were the most interesting were the ones that tied into the main storyline. So either they were just tying up some loose ends from actual main story missions, thus bringing closure to some of those story beats, or they were related to taking down various operations that tied in with the main targets that you were pursuing in the main missions. The side quests apart from those, however, were mostly just obvious filler content for the sake of having quantity over quality, and obviously that really didn't work out very well. And of course it goes without saying that things like the gladiatorial fights you can conduct in the arena or the races that you can do in the hippodrome are just complete filler content that I avoided entirely because I had absolutely no interest in them. This is all to say that the side content, even when it is good, does get very repetitive over time, and it especially gets frustrating the further you get into the game and the more those roadblocks really show up. Because as you might expect, the higher your level is, the more experience points it's going to take to get to the next level. So completing some of these side activities early on, when it doesn't take very much XP to level up, isn't that big of a deal. You complete, say, a fort and get maybe 300 experience. You complete one of the Ptolemy statues. You have a bunch of statues around that you can just smash, and that gives you a couple hundred as well. Same kind of thing for when you go into the monuments and complete whatever challenges are in to get to the ancient tablet located therein, so on and so forth. It might be the amount of XP you need just to push you over the edge very early on in the game. But the further you get into the game, even though they do increase the amount of experience you get from these various side activities, they still are only maybe about 1,000 at absolute most, and your level ups start to take tens of thousands of experience to get to the next level. Meaning that even with side quests toward the end of the game, where you're getting maybe 5,000 or 6,000 experience points per quest, you're still going to need to complete several of them to get to the next level. That may not necessarily sound all that bad, but when you factor in how repetitive a lot of these quests are, and how much of the game is just spent traversing to the area you're trying to get to complete whatever objective you're getting to, and of course just how much of the game's content is level-gated to begin with, it gradually gets more and more frustrating, ultimately culminating once you get to right around when you would be going into the DLCs. So right around level 35 and higher, the level ups become so slow and so tedious to go through that it basically takes what was already a fairly slow game to begin with and just grinds it all to a screeching halt. The thing is that even though the leveling itself is the main instigator of what grinds this game to a screeching halt, a lot of it is due to the gear grind as well. Because if you just stick with the same weapons throughout the entire game, and you never upgrade your hidden blade, or your bracer to do extra melee damage, or your ranged gauntlet to do more ranged damage, or your breastplate to increase the amount of health you have, then that all makes the amount of damage you do to enemies versus the amount of damage they do to you problem considerably worse. Because remember, the difficulty in this game is determined entirely by number go up syndrome, not by the enemies actually being particularly challenging to fight, not by them outsmarting you or anything like that. So if you neglect to make your numbers go up, then you're just making the game harder on yourself. And how do you make those numbers go up? Well, there are three main ways of doing this. The first is what I've already talked about, which is leveling up. The second is what I just mentioned, which is upgrading some pieces of equipment that you always have. So there's a bracer that will allow you to increase the amount of melee damage you do. There's a gauntlet that allows you to increase the amount of ranged damage you do. And there's a breastplate that allows you to increase the amount of health you have. Those are going to be the most directly relevant to this discussion, but there's also a couple ones for increasing the amount of gadgets that you have, as well as another one that will allow you to increase the amount of arrows you can carry for your bows. But the main ones I'm going to focus on for this particular point are the ones that directly increase your stats. So how do you upgrade those? Well, you will get various materials as you play through the game. These range from things that you gain from breaking down the various weapons that you don't necessarily need and wouldn't really benefit much from selling, into their base components, so things like hardwood or copper or iron, to things that are harvested by hunting various animals scattered around the world, so various types of hides and pelts. And you can spend these gathered materials to upgrade the various pieces of equipment in your inventory. Obviously, as you continue to upgrade them and the effects get better and better, the amount of materials you have to spend on them increases, and you'll start to encounter more and more rare materials required to improve them. Meaning that while early on in the game, and even up to about the midpoint or so, you can gather these materials just by playing the game normally, after a while you will eventually start having to go out of your way to gather these materials, meaning that in addition to the level grind, now you've got a material grind. The other main way you can make your numbers go up is by equipping better weapons or upgrading your existing weapons. You see, over time you will be gradually collecting new weapons. This can be done by just finding them scattered around the world, just in containers and such, so they're random loot, as well as getting them as quest rewards. And each of these weapons has its own specific damage values, as well as its own specific special effects, and they all have a level value associated with them. So if you're not at least the level that that particular weapon or shield is, then you can't equip it. Now, in addition to simply finding or purchasing new weapons, you can also upgrade your weapons. In order to upgrade your various weapons, if you found one that you just particularly like using because it has nice effects, then you can go to a blacksmith and spend drachmas, the in-game currency that you earn by completing pretty much everything and just looting them off of enemies and things like that, in order to level up that particular weapon or shield to whatever your current player level is. Meaning that even if you find the legendary items, which are the yellow ones, early on in the game that have very low levels, you can bring them up to whatever your current player level is, making them stay relevant throughout the entire game. And that's actually what I ended up doing for most of the game. About halfway through, I encountered the Final Fantasy tie-in event, because that was a thing that was included in this game and is still in it. And by completing that particular side activity, you're given one of the better swords and shields in the game, so I just stuck with those for the remainder of my playthrough and just gradually upgraded them over time by spending drachmas at the various blacksmiths scattered around the world. And I did the same exact thing with various other weapons throughout my playthrough as well. So those are your main methods for making your numbers go up and making sure that you can actually handle what the game is throwing at you throughout the course of it. And the simple fact of the matter is that no matter which of these things that you're actively trying to do, you're still having to grind. You're either having to grind out materials to upgrade your core equipment, or you're having to grind out drachmas in order to upgrade your various weapons, or you're having to grind out levels themselves in order to just increase your overall stats. And the further you get into the game, the longer and more tedious that grind gets. And that is what nearly all of the pacing issues this game has stem from. It's from the grind. It's not actually from the writing. The writing is mostly pretty solid, actually. It's the gameplay, where the game actively interferes with your ability to progress further in the story and forces you to go do side content just so you can get to the appropriate level to continue doing what you actually wanted to do in the first place. From a player's perspective, it is frustrating and unnecessary. But here's the thing. This whole loop was not made for the players. It was made for corporate. Because the simple fact of the matter is that Ubisoft has fully embraced the idea of create a problem and then sell the solution. You see, I mentioned that this game has two major DLCs, those being the Hidden Ones and Curse of the Pharaohs, which are included in the Season Pass if you end up getting that, along with some extra weapons and stuff like that. But what I haven't really talked about up to this point is that this single-player only game has an in-game shop, which is exactly why it has to be always online. You see, they can't just have the player play the game normally. They can't include things like cheat codes, because that would interfere with the in-game shop, where not only are they selling various mounts and other cosmetic items, as well as various weapons and shields and such that you can use in-game, but they also sell what they refer to as time savers, which is to say they will sell you ability points that you can then spend on the various ability unlocks that are available, as well as packs of the various materials you use to upgrade your equipment, and packs of drachmas, where they of course allow you to buy the larger packs for higher amounts of money, and those will give you bonus amounts of drachmas, much like you get with premium currency packs in various free-to-play games and such. And as if those weren't enough, they also sell maps in there that allow you to just immediately reveal the locations of tombs, stone circles, and hermit locations, which are some of the various inconsequential side activities you can do in the game, which, of course, pretty much defeats the point of exploring that open world that the developers put so much time and effort into meticulously detailing out. But of course, Ubisoft's not going to let a detail like that get in the way of them doing even more money grubbing. Oh, and of course you can't just directly buy anything in the in-game shop. If you go to buy the Season Pass or any of the major DLCs or the Deluxe Pack, that's not actually handled in the in-game shop. If you're playing on PC, then it will require you to go to the Uplay store or whatever they're calling it these days. I can't even remember anymore. But anyway, the main store where Ubisoft sells all of their games and all of their Season Passes and DLCs and such. Whereas the things that are actually handled in the in-game shop are all handled through the game's premium currency of Helix credits, which have been a thing since Assassin's Creed Unity, which you, of course, cannot simply buy the exact amount you want of. You can only buy them in predetermined packs, starting at 500 credits, going all the way up to 7,400 credits, and of course the in-game shop prices do not line up with any of these packs, meaning that you will always have Helix credits left over, which is of course by design because people don't want to let their purchases go to waste, and if they have money just sitting in the balance in a particular game, then they're going to be tempted to spend even more money to get even more of the in-game premium currency, so that the amount they've already spent on the game that's just sitting there not doing anything because it can't be used to buy anything on its own can then be used to buy something else. It's all just a cynical cash grab, an attempt to get people to spend more money than they originally intended by obscuring the actual prices you're paying behind a premium currency, which, by the way, the exchange rate is every 100 Helix credits is roughly equivalent to $1 US. Obviously, your mileage may vary on that depending on which region you're in, but that's what it is in the US. So that works out to spending roughly $1.50 on the purple weapons, or $2.50 on the yellow weapons, or $5 on yellow outfits or yellow mounts, and so on and so forth. And as far as I'm concerned, that's all a complete waste of money, considering that several of the packs in this game cost as much or more than the actual substantial DLCs in the game. It's just absurd to think about. I mean, again, this is a single-player only game. It's not like you're showing off these mounts or weapons or whatever to other players, and yet Ubisoft has the gall to charge full-on DLC prices for just cosmetic items. It's just ridiculous. But anyway, I've rambled about the in-game shop long enough. The point is that they are fully operating on create a problem and then sell the solution. The thing is that in Assassin's Creed Origins, you can generally muddle through the grind walls because up until the very end of the game, it's really not all that egregious. It's just irritating. Where it truly becomes egregious, on the other hand, is when you start messing around with the DLCs, but don't worry, we'll get there later on. But you know what perhaps the most frustrating thing about Assassin's Creed Origins is? I have seen so many comments about how it had revitalized the Assassin's Creed franchise, how it changed the gameplay up so much that it was a massive breath of fresh air. The thing is that the changes they made to the gameplay resulted in this not actually being an Assassin's Creed game anymore. It is primarily a hack-and-slash action-adventure game with a very simplistic combat system. You have light and heavy attacks. Obviously, heavy attacks are slower but do more damage, light attacks are faster but do less damage, and they can be chained together for up to about 5-hit combos. Aside from that, you have a shield that you can hold up to block incoming attacks, although some of those attacks will just break through your guard entirely, and you can also press a button while holding up the shield to swing the shield out in an attempt to parry an incoming attack. You can only do that during a narrow timing window, and the timing window is pretty janky, so more often than not parrying ends up being kind of frustrating, but you can still do it and knock an enemy off guard, then follow up with a combo of your own to deal some pretty significant damage. And there's also a button you can press to try to dodge incoming attacks, although that doesn't always work as well as you might hope. There's also an adrenaline meter that builds up during the fight, and it'll have different effects depending on which weapon you're using, but for example, with the one-handed sword that you see me using, what I can do is, when the meter fills up, I can press the 2 buttons that it shows in order to do a very powerful stab that can't be blocked. As far as melee combat in action-adventure games and hack-and-slash action-adventure games more specifically go, it's on the rather simple side, and while it is functional and it's certainly a better combat system than the previous Assassin's Creed games had, its implementation in Origins is a bit rough, not just because of the whole number go up problem, but because the camera and the movement don't really work as well as they should. The lock-on system in particular is a bit glitchy, so sometimes it works perfectly fine, other times you'll lock on to an enemy and the camera will move around to target them better, and suddenly you'll have a bunch of stuff in front of you that makes it so you can't see what you're doing. Sometimes it doesn't target the enemy you're actually trying to target, and whenever you take down an enemy, it doesn't always switch the target lock over to a new enemy like you might hope it would, and so there are times where instead of just fighting the enemy, you're also fighting the camera a bit, although it's usually not a catastrophic problem or anything. Then, of course, there's the movement, where this ties in somewhat with the lock-on system, where you'll try to lock onto enemies, or you'll try to target specific enemies when you're going into melee combat, and Bayek just doesn't move where you're trying to get him to move. Instead, he'll move away from things, he'll swing attacks in the wrong direction. It just ends up being kind of messy. And unfortunately, the implementation of ranged combat isn't really much better in that regard. You have a variety of bows available for use, from rapid-fire bows that allow you to shoot off 5 arrows quite quickly, to bows that will allow you to shoot a spread of arrows, to ones that are just long-range precision bows. Now, of course, you have to aim them manually in this compared to in previous Assassin's Creed games where ranged attacks were usually more lock-on based. But there are a few problems with the way this is implemented. The first of them is mostly a subjective problem on my particular part, which is to say that I absolutely despise trying to aim anything that requires any amount of precision with a gamepad. Doesn't matter whether it's an action-adventure game like this, or a third-person shooter like the Gears series, or a first-person shooter like Halo, or any number of other things. The simple fact of the matter is that gamepad controls are sluggish and imprecise, and I absolutely hate using them for any kind of ranged combat. Which is a problem, because the Assassin's Creed series has never had particularly good keyboard and mouse controls, and Assassin's Creed Origins is absolutely no exception in that regard. Now, the game does have dual inputs, so you can have a gamepad plugged in and then move your mouse, for example, and then it'll switch over to keyboard controls, and when you press something on the gamepad, it'll move back over to gamepad controls. So if you really need to, you can switch back and forth between inputs, but since ranged combat is the only thing that really benefits from having mouse controls in this, it just ended up being more practical to just keep playing the entire thing with the gamepad rather than switching back and forth between gamepad and keyboard and mouse. So I just ended up making do with the sluggish and imprecise controls of the gamepad, and more often than not was kind of annoyed by the ranged combat in this. But again, that's mainly a subjective thing. Your mileage may vary depending on how fine you are with aiming with a gamepad. But something you will run into a lot more often is the inconsistency of the ranged combat. Now, throughout the footage, you'll be seeing me primarily using two specific types of bows. The first is the Predator bow, which is the long-range precision bow, and the other one is a bow that shoots fire arrows. Now, regardless of which type of bow you're using, headshots are a critical hit, so they do considerably more damage than body shots, for example. The problem is the way they've implemented this, they've done the right thing in trying to make all of the bows projectile-based rather than hit-scan, but they don't always behave like you would expect projectiles to behave. You see, for those of you who don't really understand how ranged combat in video games works, there's two main ways of doing it. There is hit scan and projectile based. And to grossly oversimplify the way these work, in a hit scan system, you draw a straight line from the weapon you're shooting off into space, and anything that intersects with that is what gets hit by a shot. In a projectile system, on the other hand, you launch a projectile from the emitter, in this case the weapon you're using, and that just travels through the in-game space until it impacts something. This means a couple of things. The first is that projectiles can be dodged, whereas hit scan cannot. The second is that there is a travel time for this projectile. It may be very short if it's a very fast projectile, or it may be very long if it's a very slow projectile. Regardless, there is some degree of travel time from where the projectile is launched to where it ends up. That's fine, it just means that if you're shooting at a moving target, then you're going to need to aim ahead of the target to actually be able to hit it, because you have to account for the projectile's travel time. Or at least, that's how it's supposed to work. It doesn't always work this way. Sometimes you'll aim ahead of a target that's moving, and you'll be able to hit it. Sometimes you'll be aiming directly at a target, and then it will move, and the projectile will hit it anyway, even though it has moved away from where you were aiming. And sometimes you'll be aiming at a stationary target, take a shot, and the projectile still won't hit it, and in fact it will probably alert that target to your presence. It's the kind of thing that leaves you sitting there scratching your head wondering what the hell just happened, and best I can tell, there's a couple of scenarios that might be applying here. The first is that in the case of projectiles not hitting stationary targets, they might be hitting a hitbox between yourself and the target that is bigger than it's supposed to be. The thing is, once projectiles go past a certain distance, you no longer see the puff of dust that comes up when it hits a stationary object, so it's really difficult to tell. The second thing I can think of is a phenomenon that happens in the likes of the Halo series, where they have something called bullet magnetism. And the idea there is that it's part of aim assist mechanics. Now, when we think of aim assist, we normally think of kind of a soft lock-on feature, where you'll aim at a target and the game will automatically track that target for a brief period as they're moving. If they're making larger movements or they're moving quickly, then you'll need to adjust your aim accordingly. But if they're just drifting side to side a bit, then the crosshair will stay on them. Assassin's Creed Origins does implement this, but I think it's also implementing at least some variation on bullet magnetism. The idea there is that you aim at a target, and even if your crosshair isn't actually on the target, your shot still connects with the target. Now, if you want to know how that works in games like Halo, I would recommend just going on YouTube and look up Halo bullet magnetism, and you'll get plenty of videos showing off what it looks like. But the thing you'll notice is that in demonstrations of it in the likes of the Halo games, it's always on hit-scan weapons, not on projectile weapons. Because the simple fact of the matter is that when you fudge the numbers like that on a hit-scan weapon, because everything there is just instant, it's not necessarily something the average player is going to notice unless they're really paying attention. That's not how it works when you're shooting projectiles that have noticeable travel times. If you're fudging the numbers there, it's very noticeable. So I think that's what's going on behind the scenes. It's just that they decided to implement some form of the bullet magnetism idea, only it's with arrows, and because those arrows are simulated as some level of projectiles with a travel time, you notice the fudging going on a lot more than if it were, say, a hit-scan weapon like a gun in a first-person shooter. It may not necessarily be a deal-breaking issue because it does only happen some of the time rather than all the time, but it does happen with enough frequency that you will notice it gradually over your playthrough and it will start to annoy you. It ultimately just makes the ranged combat feel unnecessarily janky, which is especially weird considering that this is far from the first Ubisoft game to implement some form of archery, and those other games that came before this that did it just fine. And what's even weirder is that those other games also implemented projectile drops, so if you were shooting at a target with enough distance, you would have to actually aim higher than the target to actually be able to hit them. That's not the case with Assassin's Creed Origins. You just aim at a target and, well, just kind of hope that the game doesn't arbitrarily decide your arrow's not going to hit it. Now, that is thrown out of the window to some degree when you unlock an ability later on in the game that allows you to shoot predator bow arrows and then control the arrows in midair like there's some sort of guided missile or something, which is obviously a really weird, really video gamey feature to implement, but it does mean that you're gonna be able to steer those shots into targets more easily, so it does compensate a bit for the jank. But at the end of the day, archery is still a bit janky in Assassin's Creed Origins, and when you combine that with the melee combat, the general combat experience is just quite rough. And while it, in terms of being a general action-adventure game, is an improved combat system compared to what we had in the previous Assassin's Creed games, which is very bare bones and kind of annoying, actually, I should mention that those previous games were ostensibly supposed to be stealth games, meaning that outside of certain scripted encounters, if you were getting into combat, you were probably doing something wrong. And thus we come to a major dilemma with Assassin's Creed Origins, and one that would clearly continue with Odyssey and Valhalla, which is, what is the identity of the Assassin's Creed franchise? With the initial game, it was supposed to be a stealth action-adventure. So again, if you were getting into combat, you were probably doing something very wrong, and the combat system was almost intentionally not good because they didn't want you to get into fights with people. They wanted you to hide in the crowd, to use the environment to your advantage, to use parkour to get away from enemies and to hide rather than take them head on. The further you get into the Assassin's Creed franchise, the more they pushed the series away from that initial vision, the more they implemented combat encounters, the more they expanded on the combat and the weapons you'd have available and things like that. I mean, you can't look at the likes of Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag and tell me that that makes sense as a game about assassins fighting a shadow war against the Templars. I mean, it's a game where you play as a pirate. You're running around blasting enemies with flintlock pistols and hopping onto your pirate ship and gunning down enemy ships with cannons and things like that. The only real stealth you're ever really required to do in that game is just tailing people, which was always a really obnoxious mission, and funnily enough, it doesn't actually happen in Assassin's Creed Origins, at least not to my recollection, which is a good thing as far as I'm concerned. But the point there is that you can see how far away from the original series identity that Assassin's Creed was getting, and so when you got to Assassin's Creed Syndicate, it was actually a breath of fresh air that they tried to realign it with those series roots. They tried to put more stealth into the game. The problem is that didn't really matter in the long run, both because franchise fatigue was just at an all-time high at the time Syndicate came out, and so people just didn't pick up the game because they were sick of Assassin's Creed, but also because, unfortunately, Syndicate just wasn't a very good game. If you're curious about Syndicate, I do have a review on it. I'll go ahead and throw up a link to that here. But regardless of how you feel about Syndicate, or Unity, or any of the other Assassin's Creed games before this, it was very clear that franchise fatigue was a serious problem, and that the franchise was kind of meandering along. It didn't really feel like it was in touch with its true identity, that being the identity established with the first game. Instead, it was pretty obvious that Ubisoft wasn't really in touch with the Assassin's Creed franchise's identity coming right out of the gate. They instead saw it more as just historical action-adventure games that had stealth elements in them. Which is why Assassin's Creed Origins is just blatantly a hack-and-slash action-adventure game that happens to have a stealth system tacked onto it. Which is a really weird thing to think about in a game titled Assassin's Creed. It's not Medjai's Creed, it's not Warrior's Creed, it's Assassin's Creed. You really don't feel much like an assassin playing this game. You feel like you would expect a Medjai to feel, which is a powerful warrior who uses stealth when it's advantageous, but more or less can just run in and swing a sword around and just carve his way through enemies like it's nothing. Gone are the days of social stealth. Here, the stealth consists of, okay, are you crouched? If so, you are now in stealth mode. If you are in stealth mode, then it is more difficult for enemies to spot you unless you're fairly close to them. And enemies generally will not be able to spot you at all if you happen to be in stealth mode while sitting in a bush or some other foliage, or if you hop into one of the game's designated hiding spots like a hay bale or something along those lines, and just remain stationary while an enemy either walks past you or turns away from you or whatever, and you can whistle to attract enemies to your position and then take them out quietly. The thing is that while stealth is viable in some areas, really it's more of a tool in this game than the primary goal. And while it's certainly possible to go through very large swaths of the game using only the stealth if you really want to, you're really not incentivized to use it. Combat is not especially difficult in this game. The enemies aren't very smart. The only real danger you need to be aware of is just the amount of damage they do. Again, number go up syndrome. But even if you want to be stealthy, your only real options there are just to hide in a bush or hide in a hay bale or something along those lines, and use the hidden blade to take out enemies quietly or do stealth attacks to do large amounts of damage to them if you can't take them out immediately in one hit, or to just take out enemies from a distance using the bows or the blowpipe that you get that you can shoot sleeping darts at enemies with, or you can shoot berserk darts if you unlock that ability later on. That will, as the name implies, cause enemies to go berserk and attack their buddies standing nearby. But that's pretty much it. The only other thing you can really do is that if enemies get alerted to your presence, you can throw up a cloud of smoke to break their line of sight on you and then use that to get away from them and go hide somewhere, but there's not a point to doing that. The game simply does not punish you for getting spotted and alerting the guards, even if they go and light beacons and summon in nearby allies to fight you further. The only real enemies you need to be concerned with are enemies that are considerably a higher level than you, or the Phylakes, which are specific sub-boss type enemies that roam around the map. And the only real reason you need to worry about them is that even if you are the same level they are, they do a huge amount of damage to you, and they take very little damage from you, so it's like fighting enemies that are several levels higher than you, even when they're actually your level, or sometimes even lower level than you. The thing with the Phylakes, however, is that you can see where they're located on the map, basically at all times, and if they get anywhere near where you currently are, you'll get a very loud, obnoxious warning saying, hey, the Phylakes are near, you need to be careful. So it's not like they can punish you for not being stealthy. You'll be aware of their presence before they get anywhere near you anyway. And the especially frustrating part about all of this is that it doesn't just apply to Bayek, it also applies when you play as Aya at certain parts of the storyline, and they're about the least stealthy parts of the entire game. Most of the gameplay sections where you play as Aya are actually just naval combat, and the naval combat in Assassin's Creed Origins is not very good. Obviously, a lot of people remember the naval combat in Assassin's Creed 4 quite fondly, and I have a feeling that's why they implemented it in this particular game. But in Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, it was an integral part of the game, whereas in this, it's just a set-piece gimmick. During naval combat, you have the options of shooting fire arrows at enemies from a distance with much the same cannon mechanics you had in Assassin's Creed 4, and when enemies inevitably shoot fire arrows at you, you can hold the button down to brace while the arrows impact you, and if you release that button after the shots have hit you and you're within a certain timing window, then you will immediately counterattack with a barrage of fire arrows as well. When you get close enough to an enemy ship, you'll have the option of throwing Greek fire at them, and if you have the ship moving at its maximum speed, then when you get on a collision course with an enemy ship, you can press and hold down a button to get into ramming speed and ram the enemy ship for considerable damage as well. And then when you have allied fleet ships accompanying you, you can also call in catapult barrages, which you don't necessarily target directly at an enemy ship, but more likely right in front of them so that they end up moving into the catapult barrage. And that's it. There's no boarding of enemy ships, there's no sailing around open seas in your trireme or whatever. You just have these individual missions where you play as Aya, and she's just in command of this one trireme, and that's all it is. You just get through a couple of naval combat encounters, and then it's either back to playing as Bayek, or if you continue playing as Aya, then it switches over to just her perspective, where you're doing the same exact things you were doing as Bayek, but in a linear mission. So you're not being stealthy, or you're not luring enemies into traps. You're not using Aya's womanly guile to try to lure enemies into a false sense of security. You're not using poisons. You're just hacking and slashing your way through enemies, only it's not as interesting as it is with Bayek, because you don't have the option to switch out Aya's weapons, and you also don't get access to Senu, the hawk, so you can't mark locations on the map or where enemy positions are or anything like that. And that's actually pretty surprising given how overly reliant the game is on using Senu throughout all of the sections where you're playing as Bayek. Whenever you're playing through a side quest or even a main quest, you'll end up going into an area and it'll say the objective is in the proximity. Use Senu to find the objective. And while that certainly gets repetitive after a while, it's really surprising that when you're playing as Aya, they don't have some sort of equivalent mechanic. Instead, the only way you can spot enemies is by aiming at them with a bow. It's just a frustrating missed opportunity there. They had the opportunity to have you play as a different character and have that character do different things than the main guy you're playing, and the best they could seem to come up with there is just to have those sections be naval combat instead of, I don't know, having Aya be more of an actual assassin, and thus making her more of the inspiration for what the assassins would be doing in their clandestine shadow war. But nope, neither of the historical characters you play in this actually feel like assassins. They just feel like warriors who might do stealthy things if it's advantageous for them. And look, I get that this game is Assassin's Creed Origins. It's the origins of the Assassin Order before they become the Assassin Order. So you may not necessarily expect them to behave in the same way that, say, the Assassin's Order as of the original Assassin's Creed, or of course the Ezio games, or further on into the series would behave. But at the end of the day, what we're dealing with here is not a stealth action-adventure game. What we are dealing with is a hack-and-slash action-adventure game that has some light stealth elements, and that just feels all kinds of wrong when you think of the phrase Assassin's Creed. This is the game where the franchise fully pivoted away from its stealth roots and instead became Ubisoft's general, historically based action-adventure franchise. You could definitely make an argument, and be completely correct, that Ubisoft was doing that with the Assassin's Creed franchise prior to Origins, but Origins is where they just finally dropped the pretense entirely and fully changed this into their historically based action-adventure franchise. And honestly, that's kind of insulting to think about, because it means that they didn't have enough confidence in these ideas to spin them off into a new franchise where they just were free to do whatever the hell they wanted with it. I mean, I know that I have said this before about previous Assassin's Creed games, and it's certainly true here as well, but a lot of the broader Assassin's Creed franchise elements that are present here, like the precursors and precursor artifacts, as well as Abstergo and the Animus and all that sort of thing, really just feel like elements that were tacked onto the game because it has the Assassin's Creed branding and thus they need to include them, not because they actually make the game any better. If you removed a lot of those elements, the game would actually be better off. It would feel more consistent. You would be able to just get into the game and not have it interrupt what you're doing to have you play through a very brief section as Layla doing basically nothing interesting. And they'd also have a lot more freedom to toy around with supernatural ideas and actually have it make sense within the setting. I mean, I'm skipping ahead here a bit, but think about what they do with the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC. I'll explain it more later, but suffice to say, the things that occur in that DLC are patently supernatural. There is absolutely no logical explanation for them at all, but because this isn't its own franchise set in a mythological ancient Egypt, they instead try to explain it away with precursors and precursor artifacts, and it just ends up being really stupid. Contrast that with a moment that happens earlier on in the story where Bayek takes a concoction from a priest and experiences a vision of him fighting the Soul Serpent. They don't need to try to tack on some BS explanation of precursors and precursor artifacts because that's all just happening in Bayek's head. And it's actually a fairly poignant moment because it's him basically fighting his inner demons and doing it through a lens of what makes sense for Bayek's culture. And that kind of thing is always going to be infinitely more interesting than just, oh no, this is a thing that actually happened, this is actually now canon within the series continuity, and it happened because of an alien artifact. It's all just immensely frustrating because so much of this game actually works quite well. Bayek is a good character. His struggle to avenge the death of his son and all that entails is compelling. The setting is absolutely packed with detail, and it's really cool to wander around these ancient locations and have them sort of come alive. And of course, the soundtrack really helps to enhance the game's atmosphere, but then you actually look at it as a video game, and at best, it's just okay. I mean, as far as general action-adventure games go, most of the mechanics are not particularly impressive. That's not necessarily to say that mechanically it's a bad game, but there's tons of room for improvement, and stuff like the arbitrary leveling and the gear system severely hold the game back and just make the experience overall worse for the player. And unfortunately, Ubisoft doesn't really seem to care much about that, because these days, gaming metrics are all about keeping the player in the game as long as possible in the hopes that they'll spend extra money on microtransactions, not on actually producing a quality game that's really only as long as it needs to be. The end result of all of this, at least as far as the base game is concerned anyway, is a severely mixed bag that in isolation probably would have been fine. I mean, sure, it's a hack-and-slash action-adventure game rather than a stealth action-adventure game like we really expect the franchise to be, but at least it's set long before the norms that we expect for the franchise were established. It's set during the earliest days of the Assassin's Order, before they were even known as the Assassin's Order, before they really would be working in the shadows. And sure, the game's mechanically rough, but for kind of a spin-off title, that's fine. For one game. It's not so fine for Odyssey and Valhalla, both of which are subjects for a different video. That's really the big problem with Assassin's Creed Origins as a whole. When the game originally released, it was seen as a breath of fresh air because they tried something different, and while it was definitely very rough, in general, it works out to be a pretty decent game. Nothing amazing, don't get me wrong, certainly not worth the full asking price of $60 at the time, but if you got it on sale for, say, maybe $30 or less, it might be worth a playthrough if the setting interests you and you can put up with the jank. But when you think of Assassin's Creed, you don't really think of hack-and-slash action-adventure. You think of stealth action-adventure, like in, say, the first game or the Ezio games. And since Assassin's Creed Origins is really far removed from that, it feels more like a spin-off than an actual mainline entry. The problem there is that not only is Origins a mainline entry in the franchise, but the subsequent 2 games after it that were mainline entries doubled and then tripled down on everything that made Origins not feel like an Assassin's Creed game. And thus, Origins is in a really weird spot for the franchise. It is where the series' identity crisis really comes to a head, and despite actually being a decent game that I overall give a 3 out of 5, it's also the transition point where Ubisoft just stopped giving a crap about keeping true to the series' roots entirely and just said, nah, this is our action-adventure franchise from here on out. When in reality, they should have taken the ideas they experimented with in this particular game and just spun that off into its own separate franchise. Instead, they just deepened the identity crisis the Assassin's Creed franchise has been suffering from for quite a long time, and have ultimately just prevented this franchise from reaching the potential it could have reached if they had stuck with the principles that were put forth in the original Assassin's Creed, and ever since then have been gradually filtered out of the franchise. And rather than spinning off the ideas that this game put forth into its own franchise of full-on mythological action-adventure games and having that be able to reach its full potential, they've been actively holding back the subsequent 2 Assassin's Creed games, Odyssey and Valhalla, by keeping them shackled to the Assassin's Creed branding. And with the subsequent release after Valhalla, Assassin's Creed Mirage, trying to take the series back into more of the stealth direction, and then the fairly recent announcements regarding Assassin's Creed Shadows, Origins is a really interesting game to go back to, because you could see the franchise's identity crisis coming to a head here and only spiraling out of control afterwards. It's just fascinating. But while that's interesting from kind of a video essayist standpoint, I suppose, this isn't really just a video essay about where this game sits in its franchise. It's also an assessment of whether or not you should bother playing it and how it is as a game. But while I've already talked about how the base game is ultimately decent overall, but quite a rough experience that you should really only play if you can get it on sale for a good price, what about the DLCs? Well, let's just go ahead and delve into those, and then I'll give an overall assessment of Assassin's Creed Origins, including its DLC. Now, the first major DLC to be released for Origins was the Hidden Ones. It's set about 4 years after the events of the main game, and it starts with Bayek receiving a letter from Tahira, one of the Hidden Ones who is working to set up the Bureau in the Sinai Peninsula, and she informs him that the situation in the Sinai is somewhat dire. The Romans have taken over the region, and the locals are rebelling against them, and some of the Hidden Ones have been caught up in all of this and have been killed. So Bayek goes over to the Sinai to investigate and see what it is he can do to help out. And after discussing it with Tahira and the other members of the Hidden Ones at the Bureau, he finds out that the situation is that a Roman general Rufio is cracking down on the Sinai, but since he's particularly cautious and doesn't actually set foot in the Sinai, he'll need to be lured out, and the best way to do that would be to take out his 3 lieutenants. What ensues is Bayek working with not only the Hidden Ones, but also the local rebel leader Gamelot to take out the 3 lieutenants and lure Rufio out so they can finally take him down as well. And while things do get more complicated after you take out the 3 lieutenants, I don't really want to spoil too much for you there. To sum the whole thing up and how it ties in with the rest of the franchise, the Hidden Ones DLC basically exists to explain where the Assassins got the part of the creed that involves keeping innocents out of the Shadow War. And while it does a decent job of that, in terms of general gameplay and overall length, the Hidden Ones doesn't really have a whole lot on offer there. It does introduce the Sinai Peninsula as a playable area with its own separate leveled regions, much like with the main map, and as you might expect with that comes a selection of some side quests and a few side activities like fort clearing, and of course bounty hunters specific to the Sinai Peninsula and stuff like that. But as far as the meat of the DLC is concerned, the main story part of it, it's actually rather short. It starts you off with a quest that recommends you be at level 38, and from there it took me about 3 hours and 10 minutes to finish all of the story missions in the DLC. And by the end of all of that, without having done any major side content other than just getting the fast travel points, I had leveled up to 43, which was too shy of the level cap increase that the Hidden Ones DLC brought about. It increased the level cap up to 45. The thing is that while that probably sounds fine to you just as a casual mention, you have to understand that when you get later on in that DLC and you start to get the final main missions, the recommended levels for those are 45, and I was doing them at level 42. And if you remember my discussion of how the leveling mechanics hold you back in the base game, you'll know that with a level difference of up to about 3 like that, it was certainly doable, but it was very rough. And that's because, again, this leveling system doesn't actually make the game difficult as much as it just makes it BS. Arbitrarily limiting the amount of damage you do to enemies while arbitrarily increasing the amount of damage they do to you just drags the combat out. Again, the enemies don't get any smarter, they don't have any more advanced capabilities. It's the same kind of enemies you fight in the main game, just with number go up syndrome applied to them, and the end result is that combat can get pretty tedious if you're under-leveled for it. Now sure, you can remedy that to some degree by going off and doing side quests so that you are at the recommended level for each of the quests, but I actually deliberately went through trying to do only the main story missions, starting at the recommended level and just seeing where I would end up with that, because I wanted to know if they made it so that you could play through this entire DLC just doing the main story missions, just doing the content that actually matters to the player. Because the base game has that roadblock problem, where you will eventually hit a point where you do have to grind out at least a few side quests to get yourself up a level or 2 in order to be able to tackle the next main story mission. Thankfully, the Hidden Ones DLC is generous enough with the experience points for the levels that it's designed for, that you can actually get through it without just having to stop whatever it was you were actually trying to do in order to just do some side quest or side activity grinding just to get your level up. But even though it gives you enough experience to where you can manage it, it's, as I said before, quite rough because you're still going to be under-leveled the entire time. And I should mention that even coming out of this DLC at level 43, I was actually still under-leveled for going into the next DLC. The recommended level for the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC's first quest is level 44, which definitely seems odd considering that it takes place after the events of the Hidden Ones, and the recommended level for the quest at the end of the Hidden Ones DLC is 45, so either they've messed up the tuning there, or they knew that the amount of experience you would get for going through the entire Hidden Ones DLC's main storyline would not be enough to get you up to the maximum level for it, so they set the level requirement for the second DLC to be about what you would be at the end of the Hidden Ones DLC. And I'm more inclined to think that it's a deliberate choice rather than just a mistuning. But as for why I think that, well, it won't really become clear until I start talking more about the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC, but for now, let's just sum up the Hidden Ones DLC. It's got a very short story that certainly adds to the lore of the Assassin's Creed franchise, and it's fine for that. But as far as the actual content added by this DLC goes, it's really nothing you haven't been doing earlier in the game already. It's just with higher level numbers attached to it. And while there are bounty hunters coming after you, like in the base game with the Falakes, in the DLC they're referred to as the Shadows of the Scarab instead. All told, it's going to be about 3-ish hours long of content if you just play through the main story missions, but you might get an extra few hours out of the extra side quests and the side activities that are also included in this area. But it's still ultimately going to be pretty short. You're looking at maybe a 6 to 8 hour long DLC if you completely 100% it. And ultimately, whether that's going to be worth the $10 US asking price, or of course whatever your regional equivalent is for this specific DLC, that's ultimately going to be up to you. If you enjoyed the base game, then you'll probably enjoy the Hidden Ones DLC as well. But if you were like me and you were pretty tired of playing through Assassin's Creed Origins by the end of the base game, the Hidden Ones DLC isn't going to rekindle your interest in it. It's just going to be more of the same, and you can pretty much take or leave it. But then there's the second DLC, The Curse of the Pharaohs, which takes place about 4 years after the events of the Hidden Ones DLC, and thus about 8 years after the events of the main game, and begins with Bayek once again receiving a letter telling him about something happening somewhere else. In this particular case, it's Aya sending him a letter about some strange happenings going on in Thebes, and asking him to investigate, so he goes over to Thebes to investigate, and he finds out that a curse has been ravaging the land. Ancient pharaohs have seemingly been rising from the grave and causing havoc, and Bayek thinks that a precursor relic, much like the one that was in the main storyline of the base game, is ultimately responsible for all of this. Thus, the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC is spent exploring the area around Thebes and into the Valley of Kings in order to determine where the relic is that's responsible for all of this and ultimately stop whoever is using it from continuing their nefarious deeds. And immediately you can probably see the main issue with this, which is that while this premise is actually really damn cool, unfortunately this is an Assassin's Creed game. Which means that they can't just have all of the blatantly supernatural things you experience throughout the entirety of the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC actually be properly supernatural. They have to be explained by precursors and precursor relics, and thus that every single supernatural thing happening is just a trick of the mind. This, of course, significantly cheapens all of the supernatural events occurring in this DLC, but it also raises some questions about what exactly is going on here, because you'll have things like the Pharaoh's shadows rising and attacking people at random, so what's happening there? Is there just some random person in a costume attacking people out of nowhere? I mean, you'd think people would notice somebody wandering around in a very elaborate costume, but that's not what happens with these Pharaoh's shadows. They're just suddenly appear out of nowhere and start attacking people at random. So, what's happening there? Well, I think the game's explanation for it is that it's some sort of apparition that is conjured in these people's minds, but the damage that it inflicts is very real, so I'm not really sure what they were actually going for with it. And then, of course, there's things like certain areas that you wander around in this DLC that are depicted as the Duat, which is the ancient Egyptian afterlife, where, once again, you're running into blatantly supernatural things. You're running into giant scorpions. Your mount gets turned into a sort of spirit horse. All of the soldier-type enemies you encounter are now Anubis warriors, so they have jackal heads and such. And that's to say nothing of the pharaohs that you encounter and fight as well. All these things are visually striking, packed with atmosphere, and yet it's remarkably difficult just to sit back, take all of that in, and actually enjoy it, because instead of being able to just make a game where supernatural things happen, this had to be an Assassin's Creed game. And so they have to explain it away with precursor artifacts creating illusions. Bayek fighting the Soul Serpent in the base game was a really cool moment. It was all happening in Bayek's head, and you understood it both from a character perspective and from a narrative perspective. The narrative was that he took a concoction that was given to him by a priest and then had a hallucinatory vision. The character perspective is him fighting this Soul Serpent ultimately to save himself from his own inner demons. And while it's certainly an over-the-top video gamey moment, it not only makes sense in context, but is also a pretty poignant moment. The Curse of the Pharaohs DLC, on the other hand, requires you to suspend your disbelief far more than you've ever had to do in the entire Assassin's Creed franchise, all for, well, by the way, none of this was actually real. By the way, even after you complete this DLC's story, the supernatural stuff still happens in the region of Thebes. And there's no longer a precursor artifact being misused to explain all of that away. Oh, and bonus points. All of the events of the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC are now canon to the entire Assassin's Creed franchise, so all of the things you see and do in the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC actually happen, but they also don't actually happen. It's just frustrating because I see the amount of effort and artistry that went into creating all of these areas and the supernatural entities and such, and think to myself how cool this all could have been if it wasn't shackled to the Assassin's Creed branding, if it was just a game set in mythological Egypt, where not only can they get away with all the things they depict, but they can go even further with it and go even further into ancient Egyptian mythology. But no, it's shackled to Assassin's Creed. Therefore, it has to be illusions by a precursor artifact. It's just a frustrating missed opportunity, and the frustration doesn't stop there. The Curse of the Pharaohs DLC is where the leveling system completely falls apart. Remember how I said earlier that in the base game, towards the end of it especially, you would start running into problems where you would be roadblocked by the leveling requirements, preventing you from doing main story missions? Well, the way the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC goes, it starts you off with a quest that is recommended level 44. As I mentioned during my Hidden Ones DLC discussion, that is one level shy of the level cap for the Hidden Ones DLC, and I got out of the Hidden Ones DLC at level 43. This meant that in order to jump into the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC at the recommended level, I had to go do a bit of extra side content, and once I was at level 44, I jumped into the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC. And almost immediately started running into problems, because unlike the Hidden Ones DLC, the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC is not structured in a way to where you can only go and do the main missions and have enough experience to keep it relatively doable throughout the entire DLC. If you only do the main missions in the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC, you are not going to have enough experience points to level you up to the recommended level for each individual mission. And to make matters worse, their idea of recommended level for this particular DLC is very dubious at absolute best. To give you a prime example, one of the missions in the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC is called Blood on the Water, and it is recommended for level 48. I went into it at level 47 because that was the level I was at going through all of the main story missions up to that point, and I figured it would be fine. And indeed, for most of the mission, it actually was fine, but then I got to the end of that particular mission, and it tasked me with taking down all the soldiers that were looking for a specific NPC. So I go about doing so and find that all of those soldiers are level 51. That is 4 levels higher than I was at that point, and if you remember my discussion from the base game talks about how the leveling system works, that means that while the soldiers themselves weren't at all difficult to fight, they were basically damage sponges because I was doing barely any damage to them, and they could two-shot me. And while it would certainly be more manageable if I was at the recommended level of 48, that still ultimately wouldn't matter because I finished off the soldiers and then talked to the NPC, which I thought would finish the quest. It did not finish the quest. Instead, it played a cutscene where I talked to the NPC, and then after the conversation finished, Bayek and this NPC step outside of the building, and as part of this cutscene, a Servant of Anubis shows up. The Servants of Anubis being the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC's equivalent of the Philakes. They're basically the bounty hunters. There's only 2 of them, and they are both level 55. I get a notification that the Blood on the Water quest has now been updated to level 51 while I'm in the middle of the quest. And now I have to fight a level 55 boss enemy while I am at player level 48. And I wouldn't have even been level 48 if I hadn't actually taken the time to avoid the soldiers and go off to the area right next to where I was supposed to be doing the main mission stuff and completed a small treasure hunt area. Because that gave me just barely enough experience to bump me up from level 47 to 48. If I was going into that boss fight at level 47, it would have taken even longer than the roughly 22 minutes it took me to fight the Servant of Anubis. It wasn't even remotely a difficult fight. I only took damage once the entire time, and that was because I accidentally blocked an attack instead of parrying or dodging it. Thing is, I healed myself almost immediately because one of the things you can unlock in the ability tree is the ability to heal whenever you use an overpower attack, and those were charging up at a steady rate the entire fight, so I healed myself very quickly and then never took another hit the rest of the fight. Quite literally, the only reason the fight took so long is because the arbitrary leveling mechanics make you do less damage to enemies that are higher level than you. It wasn't tense, it wasn't difficult, it was just annoying. And after I managed to take down this Servant of Anubis and got the 2,000 experience point reward for doing so, I looked at my experience point bar and saw how tiny the amount of experience I had in it was, and I knew right then and there that I had reached the hard roadblock. You cannot go into this particular DLC at level 44, the recommended level for starting it, and only play through the main missions. Once you get to the Blood on the Water quest in particular, you hit the hard roadblock, where they say, no, you're not allowed to have fun anymore. You have to go and do some side content to get your arbitrary level high enough to where the rest of the game isn't going to be obnoxiously tedious. Now, if it were a matter of being very, very close to the recommended level and being like, oh, well, I can knock that out with either a single side quest or even just a couple of side activities, that would be one thing. But by that point, the amount of experience points it takes to level up is something around 30 to 40,000 per level. Side quests will net you about 5,000 or 6,000 at that point, and main quests will get you about 10,000 to 20,000. So no matter how you try to slice it, unless you have just been constantly doing side quests the entire game, you're just going to have to abruptly stop progressing through the story and go off and do a bunch of random side activities and side quests just to get yourself up to a level where the next mission isn't going to be obnoxiously tedious to play through. This really wasn't that big of a problem in the base game. It was certainly annoying when it did happen, but generally speaking, when you were going into the next main mission, it was maybe a level higher than you, and you could get up to that point by completing a side quest, or maybe a couple of side activities. It wasn't that big of a deal until you got later on in the game, and the experience point requirements to level up got big enough to where you did have to stop what you were doing, at least for a quest or two, in order to do some side content and get yourself up to the next level. Then, of course, the Hidden Ones DLC happened, and even though it's got higher level requirements, it still paces itself with the XP well enough that you don't really need to worry about it that much. And then they just throw all that pacing out the window in the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC. And in a game that gets as repetitive as Assassin's Creed Origins does, that's a pretty serious problem. Because something I haven't really talked about up to this point is just how long and drawn out this game gets. You see, the world you wander around in Assassin's Creed Origins is very large, and it takes a long time to play through the main story. We're talking that if you just rush your way through the whole thing and only play the story missions, you'll probably finish it in around 20 to 25 hours. But of course, in doing so, you're going to be severely underleveled a lot of the time, and it's going to be very frustrating. So obviously you're not going to play it that way. That means that it's probably going to be more around a 30 to 50 hour game, depending on how much of that side content you do. Then you have the Hidden Ones DLC. You can blaze through the entire main story content of that in about 3 hours or so. And if you take your time with it and do a bunch of the side content, you're going to end up with around a 6 to 8 hour experience. Okay, that's not that bad, on top of the 30 to 50 hours you already put into the game. But then there's the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC, which if you only go through the main story missions will probably be around a 5 or so hour experience, but then you put in all of the side content, and you're looking at roughly 16 to 20 hours of extra content. Sure, extra content is going to be good value if you were, for whatever reason, still enjoying Assassin's Creed Origins at that point, and it does let you experience some of the coolest looking areas in the game and fight some of the coolest looking enemies in the game. But by the time you get to the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC, the repetitiveness of the gameplay loop has been wearing on you for roughly 35 to 60 hours, depending on how much of the side content you've been doing. And you're looking at another up to 20 or so hours of just continuing to do the same exact things, but with a different coat of paint. The enemies you fight ultimately behave the same way as the enemies you've been fighting the entire time. The boss fights are the only thing that really kind of shakes that up, and even those don't shake it up much, because the boss fights are frankly kind of a joke. You're not given any new abilities, you don't get any kind of powers to mess around with or anything like that. You're just fighting the same exact way you've been fighting this whole time. The stealth is the exact same stuff you've been doing the entire time. And the only new-ish mechanic that they introduce is that sometimes Pharaoh's spirits will pop up in certain areas and start attacking NPCs, and you can fight them if you want. But it's basically like fighting the Falakes or other bounty hunters. So to sum this all up, even though Curse of the Pharaohs has some of the coolest environments and coolest looking enemies you'll fight, and it has the whole supernatural angle to it, those aesthetics and the general atmosphere of the DLC is not sufficient to hold back that feeling of repetition. And the Assassin's Creed branding officially becomes stifling. It's actively holding this DLC back from reaching its true potential. And unfortunately, you can see the writing on the wall from here. You can see from how they designed the Curse of the Pharaohs DLC that later entries in the series are going to delve more into mythology, and they're going to try to explain it away with precursors and precursor artifacts, and it's going to be stupid, and it's going to cheapen the whole thing. And more importantly, you can see exactly where Ubisoft's focus is going to be from here on out. It's going to be about every subsequent game being full of the same obnoxiously repetitive side content that you are effectively forced to play through just so you can hit arbitrary level numbers to be able to do the things you actually want to do. Because of course, modern gaming is all about engagement. It's not about being a good game. It's not about being a satisfying story with satisfying mechanics. It's about keeping the player in the game as long as possible in the hopes that they will end up spending extra money. And what better way to do that than creating a problem in the form of the inevitable grind wall you will run into, and selling you the solution in the form of whatever time savers they feel they can get away with. And thus, we have the very strange case of Assassin's Creed Origins. Simultaneously, a breath of fresh air in some ways for the Assassin's Creed franchise by shaking up the formula, doing something a bit different, and of course having a gap year between the previous release and this one, but also further dragging down not only the Assassin's Creed franchise, but really just Ubisoft's games as a whole through its obnoxiously repetitive open-world design that is clearly meant to keep the player in the game as long as possible in the hopes that they'll spend more money, rather than actually being good design. and also turning the Assassin's Creed moniker into Ubisoft's general historically based hack-and-slash action-adventure franchise. An incredibly cynical move that was almost exclusively done for brand recognition, because they clearly did not have the confidence to put these ideas forth into a separate franchise where they can actually go into these supernatural realms and go crazy with it without being forced to tie it all back in with precursors and precursor artifacts and make sure that all of the blatantly supernatural things aren't really happening. No, it's actually just illusions. And the worst part about it is that despite everything, buried in Assassin's Creed Origins, underneath the god-awful leveling system, underneath the repetitiveness of the gameplay, underneath the clear attempts at over-monetization, there's still a rather compelling story in there with a good main protagonist, and the amount of effort that went into crafting the world that you explore and making ancient Egypt come alive is still impressive to this day. It's just immensely frustrating that all that is buried under mechanics that at their absolute best are really just tolerable. They're not really bad enough to make you quit playing entirely, but they're also not really good enough to be compelling enough on their own to keep you playing. Meaning that what you're mainly going to be interested in is Bayek and his story, and once that's done, there's just not really much to keep you coming back to it. I mean, sure, if you already liked the base game and you want more of it, then the Hidden Ones and the Curse of the Pharaohs DLCs will certainly provide more Assassin's Creed Origins, but after having played through it myself, I really can't see a situation where people would be playing through Assassin's Creed Origins and not be tired of it by the end of the main story. And if anything, having played through Assassin's Creed Origins and seen how repetitive and tedious the game gets with that level grind makes me absolutely dread going through Odyssey and Valhalla. But we'll see what happens whenever I get around to them. As for Origins itself, like I said in the main review section, it's about a 3 out of 5. I would only recommend it if you can get it on sale for a really good price. The DLCs, on the other hand, I would say that if you are going to pick up Assassin's Creed Origins, play through the base game first. If you get to the end of that and you still want more, again, I don't really see how you'd want more, but anyway, then maybe consider picking up the DLCs, but again, only if you can get them on sale for a good price. And please do everyone a favor and avoid the microtransaction store entirely. Because the more microtransactions Ubisoft sells, the more they're incentivized to compromise their game design to shoehorn in more microtransactions and shoehorn in more time savers instead of actually producing quality games that are actually worth playing through. Thanks for watching, and especially for bearing with me over the past several weeks as I've been trying to get this review finished up. I'm definitely going to need a break from open world games after this, so expect the next few videos to be shorter titles that are much more condensed. And hopefully with those I don't run into some of the same problems that I ran into with this, where I would record some gameplay footage, and I would record even up to a couple of hours of gameplay footage. And then I'd go back and check the file, and while it had the audio recorded, there was no video feed, so I couldn't actually use it, and it was just immensely frustrating. But again, thanks for bearing with me on all the delays here. Thanks for bearing with me as I rambled my way through this video. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested, and every bit, even something as simple as $1 a month, really does help out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.